Hey y'all, let's talk about chapter 7 today. I'm going to share my screen so you can see some notes. I just learned how to do this, so I hope that it works. Let's see. Okay, all right, so we're starting at like basically 1800 is kind of when this chapter starts. And Jefferson was inaugurated as president, or he won the presidential election of 1800. And this was the first time that there was a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another. So it was kind of a big deal. A lot of people didn't know if this could happen peacefully, and it did. So I wanted to explain the two parties that existed at this time, political parties, and just try not to compare these with our current political parties in any way. So one party was the Republicans, and sometimes they're called the Democratic Republicans. And this is not the same Republican Party that we have today. Today's Republican Party began in the 1850s as an opposition to the westward expansion of slavery. So it's not the same thing. So the Republican Party of the 1800s, that was the party of Jefferson. These people were the same people who were known as anti-federalists before the Constitution was ratified. They were the people who were against the Constitution. In order for them to support the Constitution, they wanted the Bill of Rights to be put in. So this kind of tells us which side of the political spectrum they were at. They were people who feared a lot of federal power. So Republicans had a stronger focus on states' rights. They wanted states to be able to nullify acts of Congress or the president. So last week we talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts. Those were acts that probably the main thing was that they made it a crime to criticize the president or the government. And John Adams put these laws on the books. He was a Federalist. So John Adams and Jefferson weren't of the same political mindset. So Jefferson represented this Republican kind of party. So after the Constitution was ratified, the people who were opposed to the Constitution, the anti-federalists, they began calling themselves the Republicans. One reason that they had the Bill of Rights put in the Constitution before they would ratify it was because they felt like the Constitution gave the federal government too much power. So the Bill of Rights was put in to limit the power of the federal government. It basically says the federal government can't do this, 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 and this. This was by insistence of the anti-federalists, and that was the only way that they would support the Constitution. So it makes sense that they were states' rights people. After John Adams put the Alien and Sedition Acts in place, Jefferson and James Madison were very much against the Alien and Sedition Acts. They felt like it was a violation of their constitutional rights, and it clearly was, because it made it a crime to say certain things, which is a violation of the First Amendment. So Jefferson and Madison said, hey, this president, John Adams, has just passed an act, or Congress passed an act, that makes it a crime to say certain things. That violates the First Amendment. Therefore, it is our state's right to nullify that law. So any law that they felt was unconstitutional, they basically said they have the power to ignore that law or to break that law. This was the basis of states' rights theory. And just kind of keep that in mind as we move forward, because this is one of the reasons why slavery lasted so long. Because Southerners were able to say, hey, it's our state right to nullify any act that we feel is unconstitutional. And they would often say the Fifth Amendment guarantees life, liberty, and property. Property meant slaves. And so anything that the federal government does that threatens our property is unconstitutional. So this states' rights theory is pretty important to understand. Republicans like Jefferson were all about that because they wanted less federal power. They also focused on a strict construction of the Constitution. I realize I left an S out there, but can't fix it now. So they wanted the Constitution to be read in a very strict sense. And that was, again, because they feared too much power from the federal government. So they said that if a power is not granted to the federal government in the Constitution, then the federal government does not have that power. It has to be explicitly granted in the Constitution. And this was to make sure that the federal government couldn't go and do things like the Alien and Sedition Acts, because, you know, that's not a power given to it in the Constitution. So they wanted the Constitution to be followed very strictly. Republicans like Jefferson also focused on farmers. They really put like farmers at the basis of American society. So this meant that their priority was getting more land so that everybody could own their own land and be their own self-sufficient farmer. And to them, that was the only way that we would have a strong democracy. If there's like a bit of enough equality so that everybody can vote. Because remember, in a lot of states, you had to own land to vote. So Jefferson felt like, well, then every white man needs to be able to own their own land, and that'll make us a stronger democracy. So Jefferson and the Republicans wanted more land as sort of their main goal. On the other side of the coin, we have the Federalists. And of course, this party doesn't exist anymore either. The Federalists were the people who were in favor of the Constitution. They felt like we needed a stronger federal government with more power. So they fought for a loose construction of the Constitution. And that meant that we don't have to follow the Constitution exactly. There are certain powers that aren't explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution, but we can take a loose construction of it and kind of say that there were implied powers. An example is the bank. So Federalists felt like we needed a strong national bank because they really focused on industrial growth. They wanted America to grow as an industrial nation rather than a farming nation. And in order to have more industrial growth, you need things like taxes and tariffs. So the Federalists felt like, and you need banks. Federalists felt like we need an organized like national bank. The Republicans were like, no, because the Constitution does not give the federal government the power to create a national bank. So you can kind of see how their two viewpoints were in opposition to one another. The Federalists felt like we can't just limit the federal government's power to what is explicitly defined in the Constitution because things are going to change. And the Republicans were like, hell yes, we will limit the federal government's power to what's explicitly defined in the Constitution, because if we don't, the federal government is going to get way too powerful, and then we're going to be back in the same situation we were in when we were an English colony. So the Federalists wanted to grow America's industry. They didn't really have like increased land as their priority. They had things like building up our economy as their priority. So two very different kind of political parties you can already see at the beginning of America. And people always ask, like, which one of these parties was more democratic? And it's really easy to say the Republicans were more democratic because they wanted everyone to be able to own their own lands. They wanted more participation from the public. They wanted more voting rights. So yeah, it's easy to say that they were the more, democratic. But you have to remember that the Republicans were mostly Southerners who wanted states' rights, and they were mostly farmers. So therefore, they were the ones who generally either owned slaves or wanted to own slaves. They were mostly the people who were in the slave holding category. So that kind of complicates things when we say like they were more democratic than the Federalists because they were the party of slavery. Federalists, on the other hand, were mostly in the Northeast, in the big cities like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and they wanted industrial growth. They didn't care about slavery as much, and many of them were actually against slavery. So both of these parties had kind of, when trying to determine which one's more democratic, they both have elements of that, and they both have elements of things that are not at all democratic. For instance, the Federalists didn't like a lot of public participation. They wanted to limit voting to just the most qualified people, and they didn't want a lot of public debate about issues. They wanted only people who had very high educations and wealth to be making decisions. So that's kind of the difference between these two parties. The next thing I want to get to is probably the most important Supreme Court case in American history. A lot of people say that it's the most important. I think it's one of the most important, but basically it redefined the role of the Supreme Court. In the Constitution, one thing that's really genius about the Constitution is that there's a checks and balances system, a separation of power. So there's three branches of government: legislative, which is the Supreme Court, legislative is Congress, judicial is the Supreme Court, and executive is the president. And these three branches were supposed to have equal power so that they could check and balance the other. For example, Congress can veto an act by the president. The president can veto an act by Congress. And if the president vetoes an act by Congress, Congress can sort of override that veto by a 2/3 majority vote. So they're supposed to sort of check and balance each other. The problem with the Constitution was that it didn't give enough power to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't have a way to check and balance the power of the other two branches until the case of Marbury versus Madison, and that was 1803. And this case is so important because the details of the case aren't that important, but the outcome of the case was really important. In this case, the Supreme Court gave itself the power of judicial review, and that means that it is the Supreme Court's job to determine the constitutionality of laws passed by Congress or acts created by the president. So it gives the Supreme Court the authority to say that this act that Congress passed is unconstitutional, therefore it cannot stand. It also gave the Supreme Court the power to say, the president just passed this act, that's unconstitutional, it cannot stand. So the Supreme Court was able to determine the constitutionality of different laws and acts, and that is called judicial review. And that gave the Supreme Court equal power with the other two branches. It made the court have the ability or the power to check and balance the other two branches of government. And without Marbury versus Madison, without this idea of judicial review, the Supreme Court would have been very weak. It would have been too weak to do anything to balance out the other branches of government. And many people think that the Supreme Court wouldn't have even existed for too much longer if it didn't give itself the power of judicial review. So in a sense, judicial review completed what the Constitution meant to do, which was equal power to the three branches of government. And now, as we know, ever since 1803 with Marbury versus Madison, that has been the role of the Supreme Court. That has been what they have done throughout history, is say, if something's constitutional or not. That is really their only job. The Supreme Court does not hear cases about things like murder unless it has something to do with someone's constitutional rights. So the Supreme Court hears cases that deal with interpretation of the Constitution. So this chapter that we're covering today kind of deals with a lot of things. I'm not going to cover all of them, but it does get to the War of 1812. And y'all need to read about the War of 1812 in Lies My Teacher Told Me, the excerpt from that, and also in the textbook chapter. So I'm not going to go over all the details of that war, but the main thing I want to say is that war was mostly fought for land. In the United States, most Americans who were on board and who wanted to be involved in this war, their motive was more land from Native Americans. They wanted to expand America, even into Canada. They wanted to take Canada, which obviously didn't happen, but the main motivation was expansion of the land. So the War of 1812 was technically fought against England, but England had a lot of allies, Native American allies, and Native Americans, by and large, most of them fought with England because they wanted to maintain control of their land, and England was glad to have them as allies. So even though the War of 1812 was technically against England, it was more against Native Americans in America. So there were some Native American tribes that allied with the Americans, and it was mostly because their enemies were fighting with England. So they had longstanding tribe-like disputes with other tribes, and they fought with the United States so they could fight against their enemies who were fighting on the side of England. The War of 1812 ended in a stalemate, basically. It ended with the Treaty of Ghent that didn't really change anything. For the most part, the main effect of the War of 1812 was that Indians, Native Americans lost more land. So in the Treaty of Ghent that ended the war, England agreed that they would stop arming Native Americans if America stopped trying to take Canada, which was an English colony. So this was fine for everybody except for the Indians, because basically England had signed this treaty saying, we're not going to help Native Americans in America anymore. We agreed to this in this treaty as a way to end this war against America. So they stopped aiding Native Americans and stopped selling weapons to them. So people always say, the only losers in the War of 1812 were Native Americans. England really didn't lose much. The United States didn't lose much. Both sides kind of agreed to end the war with that compromise of England not helping Native Americans if America doesn't try to take Canada. So that compromise worked out well for both sides, just not the Native Americans. They were kind of on their own now. The War of 1812, you know, people still try to figure out like why we even went to war against England. Like the reasons they don't really add up. Many people think it was just to sort of make the statement that we are definitely not under England's control anymore. We are our own independent nation, and we have the power to stand up to England now. So after the end of the War of 1812, America's like confidence really soared. It was a boost to American patriotism, a boost to American strength. They stood up against the most powerful country in the world, and they didn't lose. They didn't exactly win, but they didn't lose. So definitely a big boost to American patriotism and unity. Also, during the War of 1812, the U.S. was like boycotting boycotting items from England and France. They were basically refusing to trade with England and France. And so Americans had to figure out how to make their own products. A lot of these products that they had been formerly importing, particularly from England, they now had to figure out how to produce those at home. So the War of 1812 led to a boost of American industry. Industries began to grow. They began to make products here in America rather than importing them. The War of 1812, kind of along the lines as the same lines of improving industry, it also led to a lot of technological innovations. So during this war, people on both sides kind of figured out that if you have weapons that have standardized parts, that would be really helpful. Because if this musket has this little part in it that breaks, we don't have to buy a whole new musket, we can buy this part. But you can't do that if everybody's making different muskets. So they kind of came up with this idea of standardized parts. So basically, if you buy this brand of musket and this part goes out, you can just replace that part because they're all the same. So this is really helpful to the growth of industry and technological innovations. So the War of 1812 really did have some impacts, even though there wasn't like a lot of land exchange. There wasn't really a clear winner or loser. The impacts were pretty clear. It was terrible for Native Americans. They lost their only true ally, which was England. But it boosted American confidence, patriotism, technology, and industry. Last thing I want to talk about, another effect of the War of 1812 was that it helped to end the Federalist Party. The Federalists were against the war. They didn't really want to fight it in the first place. Federalists were mostly people in the Northeast, in the bigger cities. And the people who were in favor of the War of 1812 were mostly people in the South and what was then considered the West, like Tennessee. Those were mostly the farmers. So in a sense, you can say that Federalists were against the War of 1812 and Republicans were very much for it. So when the war was almost over, Federalists were becoming more and more against this war, and they even thought about seceding from the United States. Massachusetts in general basically was like, we might not even be part of the US anymore. We're fighting this war that we don't agree with. We stated our opposition. It didn't help. The Republicans have taken over control, and now we're in this war that is meaningless for us. So before the war ended, the Federalists called a convention. They basically convened in Hartford, Connecticut. So they called it the Hartford Convention. And their purpose of meeting there was to basically compile like a formal protest to the War of 1812. And they also wanted to change the Constitution to make sure that like a war like this didn't happen again. So they had a few sort of demands that they made that they wanted to see in the Constitution. First, they wanted New England's influence they wanted New England to have more influence in America. They felt like, well, the South and the West wanted to fight this war, and now we're fighting this war. Where did our voices go? New England didn't have enough power to protest or to stop the war. So one of the ways in which they felt like New England could have more power is to end the 3/5 compromise. So from last week, y'all should be pretty familiar with the fact that the 3/5 compromise gave more power to Southern states. If this doesn't sound familiar, please go back and look at last week's discussion post. The reason why Congress voted to go to war in the War of 1812 was because the South had more representation in Congress because of the 3/5 compromise. So the Federalists were like, we need to make sure that doesn't happen again. New England needs to have more power. So if we repeal the 3/5 compromise, that'll reduce the population of the South, which will reduce their representation in the House of Representatives. So that was the first thing they wanted, repeal the 3/5 compromise. They also wanted to make sure that when Congress voted on war, that it had to be a 3/5 majority, not just a simple majority. So prior to this time period, when voting on war, like just say that there were 100 congressmen, if 51 voted yes for war and 49 voted no, we would go to war because that's a simple majority. The Federalists who convened at Hartford in the Hartford Convention said, no, for an issue as important as going to war, we need to have a 3/5 majority. 3/5 of Congress needs to say yes to war rather than just 50% or 2.5/5. So these things that the Federalists wanted, we have those things now, both of those things. We've repealed the 3/5 compromise, and Congress now does have to have a 3/5 majority when going to war. They didn't happen during the 1812 time period. These things happened much later. So when the Federalists approached Washington, D.C. with their list of demands from the Hartford Convention, it was right at the same time that Americans just learned that Andrew Jackson defeated the Native Americans and the British in the Battle of New Orleans, and that the war was over. So most people in America were so happy, like, we proved ourselves against England, we have more land now, we won this war, even though they didn't exactly win it, but like I said, they didn't lose it. So they were kind of like, yay, our new country can stand up to England once again. This was the same time that the Federalists appeared with their Hartford Convention resolutions, and they were basically laughed at. The rest of the country was like, why are you trying to change the Constitution? Why are you griping about our Constitution and griping about this war? We just won this war. We did great. Be happy. So the Federalists were kind of mocked for bringing these demands to Congress. But those demands actually were put in place later. This led to the end of the Federalist Party. They really lost their power and their kind of their reputation after the War of 1812. All right, one more thing I want to talk about. Let me find I was actually gonna, if y'all have seen everything that's on this, I'm gonna delete this, and I want to talk about the Monroe Doctrine. Ooh, look, I can draw on here. Okay, Monroe Doctrine. This is very important. This was put into place as a way to give the United States more power in the entire Western Hemisphere. It was formulated by President James Monroe, and that's why it's called the Monroe Doctrine, obviously. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to write. Okay, okay. So the thing that the Monroe Doctrine did was it said to Europe, you can no longer, I'm typing, said to Europe, you can no longer create colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And this was a pretty big deal because Europe was all about establishing colonies, and they would have looked to places like South America and Central America, and maybe even Mexico, as a place to establish a colony and sort of rule over that place. Spain had already done that quite a bit, which is why, you know, we associate Central and South America with the Spanish language. So Spain had already created a lot of colonies there. Some of them were already free by the time that the Monroe Doctrine was put into place. And so America says to England, you can't come in and create any more colonies in the Western Hemisphere. That is our sphere of influence. That's our territory. It might not be our territory completely, but it's the territory that we are in control of. And we are saying to you, England, you are not welcome here in the Western Hemisphere. No more colonies. This was a pretty bold move for such a new nation. When James Monroe came up with this Monroe Doctrine, he was trying to assert America's power, and he very much did that. It was a statement that said, like, this, we are in control of this entire Western Hemisphere, and you can't come in and do anything without our approval. The Monroe Doctrine it didn't have any legal standing, but it was just a very strong statement of American power. And it ended up lasting a very, very long time. So try to keep that in mind as we move forward this semester. Okay, I think that is all I have for today. I will let y'all go, and let me figure out how to stop sharing so I can stop recording. Okay. All right, y'all have a good day.